everyone, this is Celine from Blue Calla Patterns, and this is the final video number 3 for the Lavender Tote. And in this video we'll be doing the final assembly. To do the next step you will need the following pieces. So you'll need your assembled exterior panels. Now if you're making the small size you will actually need your exterior main panel H exterior pieces and lining pieces. However, if you're making the large size like I am, you'll need these assembled panels for the exterior, and then you'll need both of your lining pieces that you cut from the lining panel G pattern piece. Now if you're using a directional print, it's important here to pay attention. You want to have your lining piece with the pattern right side up, like facing this way. And you will place it right side facing up on your work surface, and then you're going to place your flap over top. And then you're going to take one of your exterior panels and you're going to place that wrong side facing up over top. And now you're going to clip all 3 layers together. Just going to get my clips. Make sure you're getting all 3 layers together. Now this is a little bit in the way here. Okay, so I have all the layers clipped together. Okay, now you're not going to sew all of the layers all the way across the top. You're going to take a ruler and you need to measure 1.5 inches in and make a mark, and then 1.5 inches in on this side and make another mark. Then what you're going to do is you're going to sew from this first mark to the second mark. Do not sew the 1.5 inch section at either side. So you start here, you back stitch, then you sew to the other mark and you back stitch again. Now it's very important that you're back stitching here at the beginning and the end, because we're going to be separating these layers in the next step, and you want to make sure there's back stitching so your seam here doesn't come apart. So I'm going to go over to my machine and I'm going to sew all of these layers together with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so all the layers are sewn together from this mark to this mark with some back stitching at the beginning and the end. Now I'm going to show you that we see all 4 of our layers here separated. What we are now going to do is sew the 2 exterior layers together and then the 2 lining layers together, and you're going to start at the outer edge and you're going to sew to the original line of stitching as close as you can get so that there's no gap. And you're going to do the same for the exterior layers. You're going to sew them together from the exterior edge all the way to that original line of stitching, and you're going to do this on both sides. So all I'm going to do is clip these together and clip these together, and then I'm going to go over to my machine and sew them. Now I recommend that I'm going to just separate these now. When you're sewing, don't start from this this area here. Start from the edge and work your way in, and then flip it over and fold this out of the way and sew from here to here. Now you might find it a little bit bulky here. Just try to press down on the foam to compress it and get it out of the way as much as possible. Now, because with the thickness of the foam, it can be difficult to sew your lining pieces all the way to the end. I sometimes use this tool. It comes in a couple of names, I guess, thingamajig or hump jumper. And what it does is it evens out your foot so that you can deal with thicknesses a little bit better. So what I do, now one thing I forgot to mention previously is to make sure that you do backstitch when you start and end this seam. And then as you get closer to where the foam is, press down as much as you can. And then as you're getting close to the thickness of the foam, you lift your presser foot and you insert the thingamajig. And what it does is it will level your foot when you get to this thickness. So you're going to probably have to stop and readjust the position. Now this comes in different thicknesses, so I am using a different thickness because the foam is so thick. I'm using the thicker one. Now I'm getting really thick, so I'm just going to, and then I backstitch. Now okay, so I've now sewn on both sides. I've sewn the lining pieces together and the exterior pieces together. And your bag should look like this at this stage. Now, before I continue, I'm just going to trim away my tabs and my zippers. Get those out of the way. Now you're going to press the lining and the exterior away from the main part of your flap. And what I do, because I want them to be lined up perfectly at the bottom edges, is that I like to clip those edges together. Now we're not going to be top stitching. We're not going to be top stitching the seam just yet, and you'll see why we don't top stitch a little bit later in the construction. Okay, so now I'm just going to clip these so that they stay together. Okay, and then I'm just going to take my pressing pad out of the way, and then we'll attach the other two pieces to the other end of the flap. Okay, so before we continue, we're just going to undo our zippers a bit, and we're going to fold the flap out of the way, and I'm just going to put a clip here so that it, maybe two, so that it stays out of the way for the next steps. Okay, then we're going to do the same thing. Now once again, you want to make sure, if you're using directional fabric, in this step you want it to be upside down. And you're going to place the bottom edges here of your flap so that they're lined up with what would be the top edge of your lining piece. And then again, you place your exterior piece over top, and you want to have the top edge lined up with the bottom edge here of these flat pieces. And then again, you're going to clip all the layers together. Now you're going to sew these similarly to these panels, but it's going to be a little bit different. Now in this middle part, you don't have any flat pieces. You're just pinning together the exterior and the lining pieces. So once again, you're going to be making some marks, but this time, because we only have a very narrow part of the flap, we're only going to leave a 1-inch gap on this end. So my clip is in the way. So make a mark 1 inch away from this corner, and then another mark, again my clip is in the way, and then another mark 1 inch from this corner. Now you are going to sew for about 1.5 inches, let's say, and then 1.5 inches here. So you will only be sewing from this mark to this mark, back stitching at the beginning and the end, and you'll do the same on this side. So you're going to back stitch, sew until you meet this mark, and back stitch again. Now there's a couple of ways that you can do this opening. So this isn't going to be the opening that we use to turn the bag right side out in the final steps. You can sew from this mark to this mark with a very large basting stitch. So use a basting stitch of 4 or 5. And then we can actually undo that basting stitch later on when we're going to turn the bag. And it just helps a little bit to make a nice guide for how to close the bag in the final steps. So I'm going to show you how I sew this with the basting stitch. So we're just going to change a little bit from the pattern. Okay, so I'm just showing you the view from above. I've back stitched, sewn from the first mark to the second mark, back stitched, then a basting stitch all the way to this mark, then regular stitch length, back stitch, and then sew to the very last mark and back stitch again. Now we have to repeat the steps that we did previously to sew the exterior pieces together and the lining pieces together. It's exactly the same method. The only difference this time is that we don't have a space of 1.5 inches, we have a space of 1 inch. And you're going to do the same on both ends. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go over to my machine and sew these together. Okay, so once again, the exterior and the lining layers are sewn together on both ends. And once again, we're going to press the layers away from the zipper, from the flap. Okay. Sometimes it helps to just sort of roll the seam a little bit. Okay, and then turn it over and press again from the wrong side. Okay, and then again, I'm just going to clip the ends together here. Okay. All right, now remember that we did do a basting stitch here, so when it comes to turning your bag right side out, you will have to undo those basting stitches, but that comes a bit later. Okay, so now I'm just going to pause because I need to take my pressing mat out of the way. Okay, so before we continue, we need to install the other half of our magnetic snap. You need to unclip your flap and close your zippers all the way. And then you're just going to press down on your flap, and I'm going to use my white pencil. You mark the location of your you just sort of mark the location of your snap on the body of the bag. Okay, that should do it. So I'm just now going to move this out of the way again. And then place your washer with the hole in the middle aligned with the mark you just made, and mark the location of your prongs. Now, when you're cutting out the prong holes, do not cut through the lining. You are only cutting through the exterior. So move this part out of the way. I'm out of room here. So move the lining out of the way, and then I use a seam ripper, but you can use a really sharp pair of scissors if you like, and very carefully do this so that you do not tear your fabric. I need a new seam ripper. I broke mine in half. So I'm just using this little one that came with one of my machines, and it's a terrible seam ripper. Okay. Now, once the holes are made, I'm going to apply fray check. Over the holes. And then you insert the other half of your magnetic snap through those holes. And my little seam ripper did a terrible job of getting through all the layers. Someone send me a new seam ripper. I don't recommend doing it this way. Okay. I am not having much luck. There we go. Okay. Then I'm going to just apply a little scrap of Peltex, and then my prongs. And then I'm just going to, you can either use a piece of tape to cover your prongs. I always have these little scraps of fusible interfacing, so I just always fuse a little piece of interfacing over top, and all this does is it protects your lining fabric from the metal prongs. Okay, that is it. So I'm just going to test it. Okay, perfect. Okay, so now we're going to install our piping. Now, the piping is optional. If you're not a fan of piping, feel free to just omit it. I actually really love piping, so I will be adding it. Now, all you need to do is turn your whole bag so that it is lining side up, and I just want you to clip your lining away from the edges where we're going to sew on our piping. And you can do this on both sides like so. Okay, and you really want to make sure that it is out of the way, because you don't want to accidentally sew over your clips or your pins. Okay, I'm just going to zip this back up. Okay, so now before we start sewing on our piping, you need to make a mark at all four corners, 1/2 inch from the bottom corner on the outside edge. You don't want your piping to go all the way down to the bottom because it will interfere with the seams at the bottom corners. Turn it around and do the same here. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to place it in this direction. I think it'll be easier to show this way. Now you can place your piping and then bring it over to your machine to sew. So how you want to do this is you want to start at this 1/2 inch mark at one corner and then kind of fold your piping like so. And you want the end to point outwards, so you don't want to see the raw edge of your piping. So I'm just going to put a clip here. Now I actually don't usually clip my piping the entire length because it does have a little bit of a stretch to it, and I like to make it nice and tight when I'm sewing, so I kind of tug and baste it in place as I'm sewing. But for the video, I'm going to go ahead and just show you the whole thing. Okay, so my bucket here is giving me trouble here. Okay. Now, when I get to the other corner, I'm going to do the same thing as I did over here, and I'm just going to sort of fold it over itself and angle it outwards at the other 1/2 inch mark, and then clip it in place, and then I'm just going to trim this off. And you're going to do the same thing along the other long edge, and then you're going to take it over to your machine and you're just going to baste it in place. You can use 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's not very important. The only thing I would say that is important is to make sure that the raw edge of your piping is perfectly aligned with the raw outer edge of this entire piece, because the tape part of this specific brand of piping is exactly 3/8 of an inch. So if you are very precise with your seam allowance when you're attaching the side panels, your piping should look really good. It should automatically work out perfectly. So I'm going to go ahead and clip the piping to the other side, and then I'm going to baste it in place. Okay, so now we're going to attach our side panels. My piping has been basted on. Before we start attaching side panels, we do need to mark the centers. What you can do at first is fold this in half, and then flatten it, and you'll want to mark the centers along this edge here. And you want to do it, you can do it first on your exterior and then flip it over. Now you're marking the exterior center on the wrong side, so on the foam side. Okay, and then I just I mark the center on the wrong side of the lining, like so. And then you need to do the same for these. Mark the center on the wrong side of both of your lining side panels and your exterior side panels, like so. Now when you're attaching your side panels, it is very, very important that you attach your lining side panels first. And the reason why you want to do this is because if you attach your exterior side panels first, you're making the most structured part of the bag first. And the foam part isn't as easy to manipulate as the lining pieces. So by attaching the lining pieces first, the lining is actually really easy to manipulate and scrunch up if you need to. And because there's going to be a curve, you really don't want to leave the lining to the last part. You want to do it first. So what you do is you line up this center mark with the top center mark on your lining panel first. And very important, open up your zipper all the way while you're attaching side panels. And then I'm just going to add some clips. We'll have to give this a good press once the bag is complete, so don't worry about that too much right now. Okay, so I'm going to go back to pinning. Okay, so start by pinning these center marks, then pin the bottom corners. And I always like to use a lot of pins, because while you're sewing, if one of the pins happens to fly off, one of the clips rather, if you've added a lot of them, then you don't really need to worry, because you'll still have enough holding everything in place. So here's why we did what we did with the sewing the ends separately. It's so that we could attach these without having to use a binding finish. Now normally for this type of bag, my preference would be a binding finish. I just think that it makes your lining fit snugly, and it just looks more professional in my opinion. However, I do realize no one likes a binding finish, so I decided to do it this way instead. Now, when you're sewing these parts together, do not see how it kind of puckers a little bit. It will do this while you're sewing. Do not worry, it will not show. Even if you happen to sew in some puckers, it will not show, because this part is actually tucked right up into the top corners of the bag, and when you open it, it won't even show. Okay, so I'm going to do the same, and I'm going to pin this side as well. I apologize, this part is a little bit boring to watch. Now, when you're sewing the side panels, there's a couple of important things to note. Nearly done. I know that clipping is boring, but I feel it's important to do a lot of clips here. Okay, so the important things to note here. You're going to start sewing at this top center mark, and you're going to sew all the way down to this bottom corner, but you are not going to sew all the way to the bottom. You're going to stop at your seam allowance. Now, When you're sewing the lining pieces, I always recommend taking a slightly larger seam allowance than you do for the exterior. So when you're sewing your exterior side panels on, you're going to use the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. However, when you're sewing the lining pieces together, use a larger seam allowance, 1/2 an inch, even you could go 5/8 of an inch. And the reason why you want to do that is because all of these pieces are the same size. However, your exterior pieces have some extra bulk here. That is the foam. So if you sew them with the same seam allowance, your lining will be baggy inside the bag, and you don't want that. You want it to fit snugly inside the exterior shell. So larger seam allowance when sewing on the side panels than when you're sewing on the exterior side panels. And start from the middle center mark, work your way down to the corner, and I would stop 1/2 an inch from the bottom corner. Now do the same for the other side. Start from the center mark, sew all the way down, and stop at the bottom corner. If you want to make sure that you remember, make a little line at the 1/2 inch mark so that you know I need to stop sewing. When you stop sewing, make sure to back stitch. Very important. Also at the top center mark, make sure you're overlapping your stitching or back stitching, either way will work, because you don't want to have an opening there. Now I'm going to go over to my machine and I'm going to sew this first lining side panel together. Okay, so I'm about to sew on my first lining side panel. Flip this exterior part out of the way. Just because of the foam, it's very easy to do. Just flip it out of the way. Start at your center mark. So this side I am going to sew with the side panel facing up. Do not rush through this part. It is the most, probably the most important part. So I'm going to take off a clip at the center mark. Place this under my foot. And as I mentioned, I'm using a larger seam allowance. I'm going to go with 1/2 an inch. It will probably look better if I went closer to 5/8 of an inch, but I'm going to do 1/2 an inch and start sewing. And I take one clip off at a time. Sometimes you need to adjust. If there's a little pucker, go reach in, flatten the pucker, keep sewing. And also as you're going, you might need to keep pushing that exterior shell out of the way. Okay, feel for puckers and adjust if you need to, and then keep sewing. Okay. It might be a little bit trickier at the area where you've sewn those side seams, the seams where you're attaching your front assembled panels from your exterior. Okay, past the difficult part, we're just going to zoom through the rest. And then as I mentioned, I have that line where I want to stop. So I'm just going to backstitch. Okay, cut my thread. Whoops. Sorry, hit the camera. Okay, so now I have let's show you here. One side is sewn. So I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to sew the other side. I'm going to start actually from the bottom corner and I'll sew up the other side. Okay, so I've sewn one of the side panels. You're going to repeat exactly the same thing to sew on the second one on the other side. Then you're going to do exactly the same thing and you're going to sew your exterior side panels. And you'll see here now why I recommended sewing the lining first, because it's really easy to manipulate, scrunch it up, do whatever you need to make the side panels work for the foam. Now I'm going to show you sewing one of the exterior ones just because it does involve piping. So I'll sew on my second lining side panel and then we'll come back and we'll have a look at the piping. Okay, so both lining side panels are attached, and I'm now going to attach one of the exterior side panels. So I've gone ahead and clipped it, same way as I did for my lining side panels. This time, don't forget, you're sewing with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and you're going to be stopping at the bottom corners, not at 1/2 an inch from the bottom, but this time 3/8 of an inch from the bottom. So take your time when you're sewing. If you have a piping foot, you can use the piping foot. I do not have one for my machine, and I also do not like my zipper foot. You can use a zipper foot if you like your zipper foot on your machine. So I'm just going to use my regular foot, which is fairly narrow, and I am going to sew this direction facing up because I can see my basting stitches from my piping. And what I will do is I will just make sure that I am sewing exactly 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And if you feel through the layers, you can actually feel the cord of your piping. Just make sure that you're sewing as close as you can to that cord. If you don't get it perfectly, that's fine. When you're done sewing, you have a look inside and see if you can see any of your stitching, or if you've taken in too much of a seam allowance, and you take out your seam ripper and you redo it until you're happy. And then you do the same thing for the second side panel. Okay, so I've sewn on my first exterior side panel, and I'm just going to flip it over and examine my piping. Well, looks like I got very lucky and it's pretty much perfect. So I'm going to flip it back over, and I'm now going to attach the second exterior side panel to the other side. Okay, so all 4 side panels are now attached, and now it's time to attach the bottom of the bag. You're going to have to attach the lining bottom and the exterior bottom. And I'm going to start with the exterior. It doesn't really matter which order you do these in. It's very easy. You just line up the seams. So the bottom long edge, the long edge on the bag's bottom. Now you'll remember that we did not sew all the way down to the bottom corners here, and now this is where that part will begin to make sense. So what you will do, and I will show you from this angle, it's a bit easier. So you're going to start sewing the bottom on. I'm just going to put another clip here. You're going to start sewing the bottom on, but you're going to start where you stop stitching the side panel. So at this bottom corner, and you should backstitch. Make sure you backstitch, it's very important. So all the way along, and then you're going to sew until you meet the where you stop the stitching at this corner, and you're going to backstitch again. And then you just repeat that same process with attaching the bottom to the bottom of the side panel, and then the other longer side, and then the bottom edge of the other side panel. So you always start and stop stitching where you stopped sewing on the side panels. Okay, so I have sewn on the bottom exterior, and I'm not sure if you can see. I tried to use contrasting stitches so that you can see that the stitching doesn't go all the way to the edges here. I backstitch, I start 3/8 of an inch, I backstitch, then I sew across, and then I stop and backstitch 3/8 of an inch from the outer edge. And I do that on all 4 sides. So I'm going to do exactly the same method and to sew on the bottom, except this time for the bottom I'm going to use a larger seam allowance, 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so bottoms are all sewn on, and now you're going to trim your seam allowance everywhere. So where you've attached the bottoms, where you've attached the side panels. And then once you've trimmed your seam allowance, you're going to open up your basting stitches. Remember the basting stitches that we did a while back? You're going to open that up with your seam ripper very carefully so that you don't tear any fabric. And then we're going to turn the bag right side out. So I'm going to trim my seam allowances to start, and then I'll show you the turning of the bag. Okay, so my seam allowance is trimmed everywhere, and I'm just going to undo my basting stitches now so that I can turn my bag. This is a horrible seam ripper, so I'm trying to avoid touching my fabric because I do not trust this seam ripper. Okay, so we have it opening now, and you can just reach in and pull your bag right side out through the opening. And you may find this funny. I thought this was funny, but I have some clips inside my bag that I forgot to remove earlier. So take your time here. We don't want to tear anything. You can hear my clips moving around in there. Actually, I'm going to reach in and find those. Here they are. Okay, so I'm going to push the bottom through first, I think. Which I have to do this way. Okay. Turning the bag, everyone's least favorite part. Once you have the bottom through, it becomes very easy. But because you have that Peltex in the bottom, it's not the easiest part. If you're using cork or vinyl, it'll be a little bit more challenging to turn. Okay. Okay. I'm sure it's very exciting for you to watch me turn this bag. Okay. Okay, so now what we need to do is close the opening. I'm just going to trim some threads here from my basting stitches. Okay, so what I like to do is, so you can kind of see where you had your basting stitches, and you can use that as a guide for when you're folding in this edge and clipping. And now we're going to do that final step, which is top stitching this front edge, and then again at the back edge here. And I find it much easier to do this if you turn your bag so it is lining side out. And this part here, I will actually bring it over to the machine and show you how I top stitch this part. Okay, so here we go. Now after I'm done this top stitching and we've turned the bag right side out again. I'm going to stuff it and I'm going to give it a good press because it's really, it's not looking that great from all the turning. Put my corner here. Okay, so I'm just going to turn this lining side out. Just move everything out of the way here. Okay, so I'm going to turn this lining side out. Okay. Oops, tore off one of my clips. Okay, so I'm going to bring this over to the machine and we're going to sew. We're finally going to do the top stitching along the top edge of our accent strip. If you're doing the small size, you're just doing the top edge anyways. There is no accent strip. So I'll set up at the machine and show you. Okay, so here I am doing my last bit of top stitching. So really move your bag around until you're in the right position here. Now when you're top stitching, start as close as you can to your piping without sewing over the piping because that will not look very nice. So you're going to start and do some back stitching. I'm just going to make sure that my zipper is out of the way. Okay. And top stitch. And I kind of tug because we did do a lot of moving around. So things might have come placed in the wrong position. And then again, I'm just going to pull my zipper out of the way. And then when you get to the other side, you're going to do the same thing. Try to sew as close as you can to your piping without sewing over it. And then back stitch. And then cut your thread. And then, hopefully, I'm not sure if you can see this, but the top stitching is done. So I'm going to show you in the other camera, just so that you can get a better look. And then you do the same thing for this edge. Except this time, don't forget, when you're top stitching, you're actually going to be closing the opening here where you turned your bag. Okay, so I've top stitched along both top edges of my accent strips. Now I'm going to really stuff the bag. I'm not going to tear paper here, but I'm going to stuff the bag and close it, so zip it shut. And then close your snap. I'm going to put more paper because it's not stuffed enough. And then I'm just going to press the bag. I also like to kind of press the bottom seams like this. There's the bottom of the bag. So I'm just going to give it a final press and that's it. It's done.